Hello and welcome to this episode of For Health's Sake. I'm Charles Alessi, and today I have the real joy of having a conversation with somebody who knows an awful lot about healthcare, an awful lot about how to manage and not to manage change, and that is Richard Barker. And Richard, who I'll introduce in a second, has a pedigree in terms of stuff he's done and stuff he's been exposed to, which would make most of us feel that we really haven't started yet. So, Richard, introduce yourself first, please.
Yeah, so this is Richard Barker, Professor Richard Barker. Over the years, I have done a range of things in healthcare that come together really in this era of precision medicine and precision health. So I have had CEO level positions on both sides of the Atlantic, in medical informatics, in diagnostics, and in therapeutics. I've sat on the main board of a big pharmaceutical company, but I've also spent a lot of time in and around the National Health Service. So I'm delighted to have the chance to talk about these subjects with you, Charles.
Thank you. So let's launch into this, because it's really interesting the way, and you've lived this, Richard, over the last 10, 15 years, the way non-communicable diseases in general, what we call long-term conditions, lifelong conditions, has changed. You remember the 90s, when we were really completely thrown into this new world of guideline associated care rather than opinionated care, which is really where certainly people like me came from in terms of our medical training, to where we are now. And could you describe how that has changed, and really what do you feel about these changes?
Well, it's often said that we're on a journey. We are on a journey, Charles. You referred to the emergence of evidence-based medicine, which is obviously a good thing. Who would not want to have evidence? Which leads us to medical guidelines, whether they be issued by a professional association or NICE. But then the recognition that the counter argument is that's cookbook medicine and every patient is different, and people like yourselves are going to be better at figuring out what a particular patient needs or wants or would comply with. And so therefore we're in a tension between standardized guidelines and, if you like, precision health, precision care. That's the first thing to say. But the second is the enormous changes that have happened in the last couple of years in and around the pandemic. Firstly, the fact that there are fewer in-person consultations. There's a lot more going on online, voice or video. But secondly, that we have built up this huge backlog. And so we've moved backwards, actually, in the management of long-term conditions, particularly conditions like diabetes and hypertension and hyperlipidemia. And so we are really running fast to go back to the state that we were in 2 or 3 years ago. And so clinicians, I think, are faced with this enormous challenge of working back on the backlog, but also doing so in a way that is sensitive to the different patient characteristics that we've got. And hence the ability to be able to say, okay, so the guidelines say this, but in your case, I think this is either more appropriate or more likely to get your compliance. So I think we're at a very exciting time. I like to think about these things as community clinics, by the way. You're a GP or have been a GP, and so much talk is about what the GP can do, what the GP sees. But actually the management of long-term conditions, the GP ought to be in charge of it. But we've got so many other skill sets that can be very helpful. Other healthcare professionals, practice pharmacists, even community pharmacists, nurse practitioners. So people who can pitch in and manage these patients as a team. And that could be a much more productive way forward. We see the beginnings of it in many places with diabetes clinics, but I think they could go a lot further.
I think they can go a lot further. I'm going to take exception of this exciting time, because I don't think this exciting time is what a lot of the clinicians feel at the moment. And I'm not going into the fact that they may have issues in terms of workload and burnout, and I mean we all understand that. I'm reflecting more on the fact that really what you said is that they would be in a position whereby they have to assist an individual in a personalized way. And I think that the challenge of working in an environment where they feel their conduct is constantly being assured by organizations which are outside of where they work, the General Medical Council equivalent in whichever country in the world, for example, makes clinicians really quite anxious about the medical legal implications of diverging from a generic standard. Don't you think that's an issue?
No, it clearly is. And I'm not a practicing clinician, so I shouldn't pretend to understand some of the pressures that these various, like the Care Quality Commission in the UK, the pressures that people are put under. And so job one is definitely being able to apply the standard medical guidelines more professionally to patients. But we really shouldn't ignore the future, and the future is precision medicine and precision health. I bet, Charles, we haven't time for it, but I bet you could tell stories of how you had patients who you did something off guideline for and was really glad you did. And so we have to equip the medical system, these community clinics, as I like to call them, with the best technology that enables them, yes, of course, job one, to apply guidelines more consistently and responsibly, but job two, increasingly be able to respond to the individuality that every patient's life represents.
So let's move the precision medicine bit to the side for a moment. I think we all understand that, but perhaps the precision health bit is something which a lot of people could have questions about. And of course, as time goes on, we're thinking more around lifelong interventions in all these conditions. And that happens, of course, pre-symptomatically, before people develop the symptoms in the first place. Now, a lot of clinicians would push back on this and say, but is that my job? Is it really my job? I fix things. I don't necessarily stop them happening. I don't even have time to fix the damn things. You're expecting me now to even stop them happening before they happen. I just don't have time to do this. You've actually, oh, Pascal, you bad boy, leave me alone. Sorry about this.
No worries. Do you want to just take it back from maybe the beginning of the question?
What was the question? I can't remember.
Oh, I mean,
how could you be expected, Charles, to be anticipatory?
Yes. So clinicians are concerned about the fact that they are pressurized already in terms of the management of the precision medicine bit and all the pressures associated with it. So clearly they're even more exercised about the fact that they're somehow assumed to have responsibility around what happens before people get symptoms, the long-term management of risk factors associated with disease. What's the solution around that? Is there a solution? And what role do the doctors play in all of this?
So I certainly wouldn't want to place all of the responsibility to look at somebody's health future on a general practitioner. They just don't have the time. They don't have the resource. We're moving towards a world where increasingly the generations coming through want to be proactive about their health and are increasingly getting tools, online tools, wearables, and so on, that enable them to be much more proactive and predictive and preventive in relation to their own health. And we will soon see the ability to be able to connect that into the information systems that doctors have available to them. I mean, take continuous glucose monitoring, for example. We're doing a project, my company MetaDevice is doing a project looking at continuous glucose monitoring signals, hour in, hour out from diabetic patients in Switzerland, this is, and being able to anticipate where those readings are taking you and how certain types of therapy are working better than others. Certain meals are having a greater effect on blood glucose than others. And so this intelligence and the gathering of intelligence through time, whether in the form of medical records or things like continuous glucose monitors, blood pressure monitors, and so on, this all has to come together in an intelligent way in front of the patient and in front of the clinician, which is why things like artificial intelligence are going to be needed to be able to make sense of all of this. I certainly, to go back to my first point, wouldn't want to place all of that on the shoulders of a GP.
Yeah, on the shoulders of any clinician, whatever role they have, because of course, if they're in a narrow role, an individual encompasses somewhat more of that. They're always going to be under pressure. So I think that's fair, and I think there is potentially a way through this. But what about all the genomics that comes on with all of this, and the implications of being able much more easily to be able to predict which way a condition will develop with an individual? What about, how does one manage the conversation? How does one manage the decision making associated with the interaction between clinician and carer? Because the carer is under more pressure because they know which way this is going, but the decision ultimately needs to be taken by somebody else, the person being treated.
So I think you're asking two questions, or at least two questions. Let me put the carer one to one side for a moment and address your genomics question. That is very disease specific. So genomics is already very important in the treatment of cancer. The mutational patterns in a tumor are already guiding clinicians and tumor boards to prescribe different combinations of drugs, patient by patient, according to the profile of their tumor. We're beginning, of course, to see genomics revolutionize the way in which inherited diseases are managed. All of those mystery diseases, those diagnostic odysseys that poor families went through, genomics has been able to cut through a lot of that. The questions we were answering earlier about long-term conditions, though, we will progressively see polygenic risk scores, and there's a big, as you know, big experiment underway in the UK called Our Future Health, playing an increasing role. But again, it just adds to the informational burden. And so we are going to have to figure out smart ways of weaving that polygenic risk score information in with the medical records, in with any wearable information. So we do have an information explosion to manage. You talk about the relationship between carers and patients, and I'm not sure quite what you had in mind there, but you know, when you've got people towards the end of their lives, people who are frail, and I have people in my family who are really suffering at the moment, are really at their wits' end, you really do have to be able to direct information both to the patient and to the carer. And frankly, the system's broken. Frankly, you know, frail patients in hospital, you have to go and interrogate doctors to get that information. So in this information data-driven age that we're entering, one of the big problems, I think, is actually allowing families to get much more transparency of what's happening to their loved ones.
Families and the individuals themselves.
Indeed.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for that little gallop through what is a subject which we'll be taking on at much greater depth and scope over the next few months, and obviously in Helsinki, where there's a whole stream associated with this subject. And we look forward, of course, to continuing those conversations there. Thank you, Richard.
A great pleasure always to talk to you, Charles. Thank you very much.
Thanks.